Welcome back to another episode, or rather lesson about Ottoman history, about the history of the Middle East between 1300 and 1800. And today I want to speak about the Harem as a center of power during the 17th century. So just to give you a timeline of some of the events we've been talking about so far, we spoke about the reign of Sultan Suleiman from until basically 1520 and 1566. Then there was a variety of wars in the late 16th century. And more specifically, we're speaking about the Jalali revolts from 1580s, 1640s, more concretely. These are a series of very destructive revolts and banditry events in the Anatolian countryside that were very difficult to put down. At the same time, the Ottoman Empire is mired down various wars in 1630s with the Safavids. And we come to the first deposition and execution of a sultan, or rather, the first deposition was the one before him, but the first sultan that was executed was Sultan Osman II, and he was executed by his own troops, which I'll get to in a second. This is actually a pattern that reappears over the 17th century here. We have different figures deposed, switched around, and occasionally killed at different points. And this continues basically until 1703 and one more event in 1730. Why were there so many depositions in the palace? Well, part of it goes down to succession politics and the transformations, but I do want to focus on one event in particular. This is Genç Osman, or Young Osman. He's Osman II. The first Osman was the eponymous progenitor of the Ottoman dynasty, which we don't even really know anything about, or even if his name is really Osman, but he existed probably sometime in the late 13th and early 14th century. Osman II is famous in a sense for a different reason. He was the first Ottoman Sultan to be overthrown and killed in 1622. And in fact, as you can see, his reign was relatively short, about 4 years. And because he came to power at the age of 14, that's why he's called young. His reign is really just basically his teenage years. Why did such a young man come to power? What was going on that allowed this to happen, and why ultimately was he pushed out? So, by the way, Osman II came to power because his uncle Mustafa I was declared mad. He had some sort of either a severe mental retardation, or some sort of more serious mental illness, to the point that it was regarded completely impossible to keep him in power, even as if in a sort of figurative role. And one of the things that Osman II tried to do is to regain power in a centralized state, especially away from the janissaries and from different elements in the army. Almost possibly trying to create a new army that would challenge the janissaries, would be a new form of a power base. But this ultimately didn't come to be. He was felt to be enough of a threat to the different interests at court that he was deposed by his own soldiers. And this is quite a shift, of course, from the janissaries that had defended the Ottoman Sultan Bayezid when everyone else had abandoned him in the Battle of Ankara against Timur, or Tamerlane, in 1402. There, the janissaries were loyal troops. Here, 2 centuries later, or 220 years later, they are overthrowing and even killing the Sultan. So what ended up happening? Why is it? What's this transformation in the nature of succession and of troops that explains this? And where does this all come together? In the previous lecture, we talked briefly about some environmental transformations that coincided with the overthrow of Osman II. But I think we can see a variety of other things going on here. One is that it might symbolizes sort of the end of a patrimonial state in the sense of having a strong sultanic figure at the head of the state who is, distributing power, etc. Now the Sultan is no longer a supreme leader in the same vein as Mehmed II was, in that he can act autocratically, if to any degree he ever really was. But we do find over the course of the 17th century that power becomes distributed amongst many different parts of the court and of larger society. So what that means is that the power to act, the power to govern, the power to say who's in charge, to demand a say in society is much more broadly distributed. It's distributed across the court. So courtiers, palace employees, eunuchs, as we'll see today, women in the palace, etc., bureaucrats, religious scholars, janissaries, and more, all demanded a say in the politics of the empire more directly. At the same time, even the people themselves, the people of the city, the preachers, all sorts of people wrote and cajoled and gave sermons and talked and rebelled on the streets, and also forced the Ottoman government to incorporate them in some sort of manner. Now, what we're going to look at is one of those transformations, that is of the women. And women, in this case, are missing from, let's say, if we look at the genealogical charts that the Ottoman dynasty prepared for itself, you just see lines of succession of a male heir. And in fact, they were very proud of the fact that their dynasty continued with an uninterrupted male line for about 600 years. And it seems to give the sense of a dynasty and control, right? Men going on forever, but who really holds the power behind the throne? And one of the groups that became most powerful is essentially the Queen Mothers in the, let's say, between 1600 to 1650. Now, this all entails a larger transformation here. One of the things that's going on is that the makeup of the palace is changing. So the elites that used to be recruited through slavery, through this devshirme process, again, those are taken from Christian subjects within the Ottoman Empire. The best of them are trained in the palace, where they become elite administrators, etc. Those positions of governing, of major governmental power, used to be only open to essentially slaves or people raised or brought in through slavery. Freeborn Muslims had not been allowed to enter. But starting around 1600 or 1550, they started becoming a more noticeable presence. And in fact, people in the governments called them foreigners, ajnabis, because they represented a new elite, or not elite, but a new presence of power brokers that were coming in from other forms of recruitment, sometimes just attachment to more powerful figures, etc. But we see here a different entrance to government. And in fact, by the early 17th century, the devshirme essentially ends. The government stops taking slaves from Christian areas and a levy of children. They just recruit freeborn Muslims. Now, this only actually applies to the men, because the palace itself continues to be made up of freeborn Muslims. Basically, everyone serving as a freeborn Muslim, except for the eunuchs and the literal slaves. That said, everyone still calls himself a slave of the Sultan, even if they're have always been free. Now, another point here is that within the women's side of things, the women recruited to serve in the palace and to be queen concubines and eventually queen mothers, but also to serve in the harem. All of those people continue to be recruited through slavery, right? So slavery continues to function as a method of government recruitment for the female side, but the male side is opened up to freeborn Muslims. Now, as I pointed out, there's various centers of power in the 17th century. What we're going to talk about is the Queen Mother here, number one. But there's other ones too. The Grand Vizier becomes increasingly important, the Sheikh al-Islam, different preachers, janissaries, eunuchs, scribes, bureaucrats, the people themselves become points of power. But I want to focus on the harem. There's many different meanings of the word harem. It could be sanctuary, it could be like an inviolable space. But when we say the word harem, usually something like these Orientalist 19th century paintings come to mind. On the top, on the top and the right, as seen here, spaces of pleasure, spaces of hedonism, etc. The actual harem itself probably looked much different. These are all just imaginations by Europeans trying to create an imagined other or different vision of themselves through these drawings. On occasion, we do actually have members of imperial harems taking photos of themselves, as in this one taken by the Qajar harem. In this case, it was basically the Qajar Shah in Iran was an obsessive fanatic of photography when it first appeared, and so was frequently taking pictures of his surroundings, or in this case, of the female members of his family. Now, where is the harem in the palace? Remember, it is over here. There's 3 courtyards. The first one is out here. This is the second courtyard. Each courtyard has increasing levels of selectivity between almost no one except members of the kind of close imperial family or close servants of the dynasty can enter the third courtyard. This is where pages would be trained and treasury exists, etc., etc. And only the Sultan and his immediate family and their servants and slaves could enter the harem, which was centered here. And as we'll see, the Sultan spent more and more time in that area. Now, how do we get beyond those representations we saw in those paintings and move into what was actually going in the harem itself? Well, in this case, we just have to understand the 2 major roles that became power centers in the early 16th century. One is the so-called Valide Sultan, the Queen Mother, that would be the mother of the Sultan currently in power. And the second is the Haseki, the chief consort or concubine. So, as I mentioned, everyone in the palace was technically referred to as a slave, as a kul, whether or not they were actually literally slaves. On the female side, they continued to be slaves. On the male side, by the 1600s, early 1600s, basically everyone was a freeborn Muslim. But overall, the reason why the Queen Mother and the Haseki and the eunuchs themselves become more important and more powerful is because that is where they are with the Sultan, who's making the most decisions during this time. They are with him most closely, and they control access to him and are able to influence him more clearly. And this starts with Mehmed II, who, in the process of kind of increasing his grandeur, started retreating from public, making himself more inaccessible, just like, I don't know, a celebrity would or so forth. Not someone that you could just walk up to and demand and talk to, but really making himself invisible from daily interactions in order to increase his aura of power. And this process continued over time, in which the Ottoman sultans became very much images that you would see abstractly, but rarely engage with in person or in vision. And in fact, very few people did see the Ottoman Sultan. And if you remember, even in the audience, in the imperial divan and the imperial council chamber, he would look through a sort of grilled window, so you were never quite sure if he was listening to the events in the imperial audience chamber or not. Now, this coincides with transformations in dynastic succession. So to make a long story short, remember that one of the things that was unique about the Ottomans is that instead of splitting up their lands between all male heirs equally, as was common in like Turco and Mongol polities, what they did is essentially have a sort of survival of the fittest. They gave everything to one male heir, so they didn't split up their territories. Now, this meant that basically the male heirs, the princes, were sent up to the provinces to be trained as rulers, and then on the death of the father, they would run back to the capital, consolidate their power, and usually try to kill their brothers upon doing so. Now, this was consolidated and kind of formalized under Mehmed II. After Suleiman, it switched to a system of semi-primogeniture. So primogeniture is when the firstborn son takes power. Semi because it could switch around, etc. So Suleiman himself killed a few of his sons when he felt that they were a threat or conniving, etc. But more importantly, the sultans ended up killing their half-brothers upon their coronations. So assuming the firstborn took power, he would then, upon consolidating power, then just come into the harem, take all of the princes and have them killed. And in fact, it was noted on coronation day, the day after, not only would the new sultan come out, but also a line of coffins would come with him, and they would be buried in the father's mosque, or tomb rather. And if you go see the tombs of different Ottoman sultans from that period, basically 1560 to 1610, you will find all sorts of little graves there, and those are the graves of his children, many of whom were killed as infants or small children. Now, this, of course, created what we would now call a public relations disaster, a PR disaster of some sort. It seemed very impolitic and very incorrect to kill children. And it was also a threat to the dynastic succession. Why? Because in the process of killing all the other male heirs, if something happened to the one surviving male heir before he had children, then the dynasty could be in trouble. Now, this normally wasn't a problem because princes would, when they used to be sent out to the provinces, would start having children with concubines, etc. And then by the time they came to power, have a set of children who could possibly succeed them. Now, as the sultans moved further and further into the harem and spent more and more time there and removed themselves from public, once they were in the harem, their sexuality was actually quite closely controlled. They were not allowed to have children until they became rulers, basically. So what this meant is that there was a limited amount of possibilities for these men to procreate. If you go into the harem, it's actually quite small, so you can imagine it's not that easy to find a place to do something like this. They probably didn't have their own concubines in there, and all sorts of problems arose about providing enough legitimate heirs. And in fact, there was a backup plan of using the Crimean Tatar dynasty, who were vassals of the Ottomans and distantly related to them, as a possible source of heirs in the case that there wasn't a clear male heir to take over. Now, ultimately, it was seen as one, bad to kill all these children and also dangerous dynastically. So they switched to a system in which the Sultan just the throne was given to whoever was the most senior son, a male heir usually. Sometimes this would pass on to the oldest son, and then his brother, etc., and then maybe to the son of the longer reigning sultan. But what this meant is that by 1610s or so, Mustafa I was the first one to be given the throne just due to seniority, Everyone else, these princes remained in the kafes of the harem. They basically stayed in the harem, and they're only brought out on coronation. So um, you can imagine a situation in which someone is brought out from the harem who has possibly never even emerged from that space or engaged very deeply with it, doesn't know, especially in these early periods, doesn't know if he's being brought out to be killed or brought out to become um, sultan. And in fact, one of the reasons why they speculate Mustafa the First went mad is because of this fear. In any case, this system was seen to be more conducive to dynastic succession and safety, was less bloody, and was probably safer. But you didn't really have a choice necessarily who was the most senior of the sultans, sorry, of the male heirs. In the case of Mustafa the First, it turned out that he had severe mental problems or retardation. In any case, he ultimately was seen as unfit to rule, and he was overthrown or taken out by his courtiers, by the government itself. So we have a situation in which the sultan is now being, let's say, changed when necessary, right? It also means that at every moment you can just kind of overthrow the sultan and just go to the next possible candidate. So when you have a system like this, it becomes much easier to overthrow the sultan and move on without instigating a civil war. That you would have major power struggles in the system to keep to support each candidate. Another important point, by the way, let me see if I have a slide about this. The sultans never got married. They only Suleiman had a wife. He married his longtime love interest Hürrem Sultan. They had multiple children together, but that was rare. Also, the very early Ottoman sultans married, but it's not common for them to get married. In fact, they never did. Moreover, they had concubines. They procreated that way. But the moment a concubine gave birth to a male son, she essentially stopped procreating. She was not allowed to have sex with the sultan anymore, and she could not give birth to any more children. So you don't have a concubine creating multiple male heirs. Once the male heir is born, and there's multiple concubines, so there are multiple male heirs from different concubines. But once that male heir is born, all of her energies go towards protecting, educating, and ensuring the success of her son. And in fact, because of this kafes harem system, the queen mothers and the chief consorts become essentially the strongest and most influential people in the lives of sultans. They are the ones who are basically connecting the sultan with allies, bringing in information, negotiating everything, because their own success in power can only be assumed with the success of their son. So they're doing everything possible to bring their son to power, or at least waiting until that moment when he's chosen. Now, what did queen mothers do? Well, one is that they created alliances, because the sultans were no longer going out into the countryside, into the provinces, and training to be governors. They were instead stuck in this harem. They were dependent completely on the eunuch and their queen mothers for connections to the outside world. And the queen mothers themselves didn't go out or exit too much from the harem, or from the palace at least. And so they were dependent on alliances created through marriage bonds. So the queen mother would essentially marry princesses off to different statesmen to solidify alliances and to ensure that when her son came to power, or if he was already in power, to continue those alliances. The other people that they get off is different slaves that were working in in the harem. For example, wet nurses, when they aged out of that job, servants, etc., they could be married off to soldiers or statesmen, etc. Um, Sometimes the second or third wives, but they created these different bonds and allowed connections. And through these women who were moving in and out of the palace could figure out information and pass on negotiations, etc. Right. So this is how the queen mothers operated. Now, in this sense, it helped if they had multiple daughters before they had a son, because they had more princesses to marry off. And it's only with the support of a queen mother in this sense that a sultan could succeed. And in fact, one of the reasons why Osman II was easily overthrown and taken out was not only the fact that there was another heir uh, in line. In fact, there wasn't. They put Mustafa the First back on, and he was severely brain damaged. They instead he didn't have a strong mother. His mother wasn't there to support him with alliances, to feed him information, to fight for him as a proxy, etc. And therefore, he was, to some degree, for that reason, pushed out. Now, the most powerful queen mothers are these women. So, Roxolana Hurrem Sultan, she was the wife of Suleiman. She wasn't, she was a queen mother in that she gave birth to a few sultans. But she was a bit different in that she entered as a slave, but then was actually married to Suleiman. She really broke all sorts of different boundaries and visions of the role of the queen mother. But this is slightly before the time of the harem. Instead, we have a period specifically between Nur Banu Sultan, Qasim Sultan, and Hatija Turhan Sultan, each of which are mothers of some long-lasting sultans. Murad IV was around for about 25 years. Mehmed IV was around for 40 years. And in fact, he was enthroned as a boy. And during these periods, essentially because he was so young, his mother ruled in his stead. These two, as you can see, Qasim Sultan was the grandmother of Mehmed IV. Hatija Turhan Sultan was the mother of Mehmed IV. And in fact, they consistently fought, and there wasn't really enough space for one queen mother or one queen grandmother. Ultimately, with Hatija Sultan apparently having Qasim Sultan murdered or assassinated. So politics in the palace could get quite bloody. Now, another point that the queen mothers held is with legitimacy. If you remember, Ottoman sultans, upon having a major conquest, were entitled to build like a gigantic communal mosque. The first one was that of Fatih Sultan of Mehmed II. But also Selim, Suleiman, all of them, they had these major ones. Ahmed I has the Blue Mosque in next to the palace. But the problem is, over the 16th century, it became harder and harder to sustain these conquests. The conquests were small, the battles were long, they weren't decisive. And the sultans basically lacked the legitimacy to build a mosque. And in their place, often the queen mothers and chief consorts who had massive landholdings and stipends, they were immensely rich, started patronizing and building mosques. So this is the new mosque, the Yeni Jami. It was built by the Queen Mother, I believe, started by Durbanu, I believe, who had to stop for some reason, and then it was taken up by Hatija Turhan Sultan, who finished it. This is a major mosque right at the port area as you come in to the Golden Horn. So these were major events, and in fact, queen mothers continued to build large mosques, often not on the top of hills, as we see here in Mehmed's Mosque of Fatih Sultan or the Suleymaniya. But they do build them in other places. Like, for example, at the port, or here in Uskadar, on the other side of the Bosphorus. So they do build massive mosques and complexes, but usually not in places where the Sultan would build. But it showed the continuation of patronage by the dynasty. So I'm going to end that for now. Until next time, I wish you good luck.